Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 46 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike. That is Gavin. Gavin, do you want to tell everybody exactly what your current recording setup is right now? Because when you told me before we started recording, I got a little giddy on the inside.
I sure do, Mike. And so this is actually going to serve in place of the calendar because I do not have the calendar in here with me. And by in here, I mean
Good.
inside a little blanket fort that I made for myself. So a little background. Because I do not typically just make blanket forts for fun, although I really should. We all should, realistically.
We all should.
So I am still in the hotel. If you did not listen to episode, I don't remember what it was, but about me having a job. So only a couple of episodes ago. But so I've been living out of a hotel, more or less for
It was
the
41
last
or 42, I think.
Yeah, somewhere in that area. But yeah, I've been living out of a hotel for the past a little over a month now because I'm working a job out in the desert, monitoring a construction project for fossils. And this past weekend was the first time that I was able to go home back to my apartment in a different part, non-deserty part of California. And but they put me in a new room when I came back here on Sunday night. The room that I had was perfect. There was a nice big desk, and it was not super echoey. I could just sit at the big desk and record the podcast. This new room, not so much. The table's really little, and it's very, very echoey. So I decided there was only one possible solution for that, and that was to build myself a blanket fort. And I didn't realize until we started recording.
I'm so jealous.
Yeah, like I'm having so much fun in here. And I didn't realize that I didn't have the calendar in here with me until after we started recording. But you know what? I haven't even looked at the calendar, so if it turned out there was a good paleontology one in here, I'll just do it next week and lie to you. You won't know
First
the difference.
time for everything.
So
this is true.
Anyway, also there was also a somewhat selfish reason as well, other than just not wanting to move, which is pretty selfish, for not getting the calendar. In that this episode is going to be a little long, just because I really enjoy the group that we're talking about in this episode, and that is rhinos. Rhinos are some of my favorite animals.
Which I'm looking forward to.
They're so funky and so charismatic. And so we're getting back to sort of our roots of talking about a specific group of animals today. And it's a group that I actually worked on a little bit for my thesis, not too much, but I'm generally familiar with rhinos as a whole, but I did learn a whole lot for the background for this research as well.
So, question for you.
Yeah.
Before we even get started here, so we're talking about rhinos this episode.
We sure are.
How correct am I to just say that a rhino is a unicorn?
We'll circle around to that at the end of the episode for sure. So
Okay.
Not mostly incorrect, but not totally incorrect.
All
right.
But
you're pretty close though.
By the way, for everybody,
Go ahead.
Just for everybody at home listening, if there's a slightly larger than normal delay, you can blame Gavin and his hotel Wi-Fi. But we will do our best to work around that as we talk through this episode.
Yeah, that's true. The hotel Wi-Fi. I mean, it's a 3-star hotel. You can't expect 4-star Wi-Fi. So
no, look, this is a 3-star podcast. So this is what you get.
Yeah. So rhinos are, you're starting at the very basic level. Rhinos are mammals. So they're vertebrate animals with backbones, just like you or I. They're mammals, things that with hair and things that produce milk, like you and I. And within mammals, they are ungulates. Meaning
Whoa.
Okay, I do not produce milk, if that's what you're getting at.
You and I are... Okay. All right. Okay.
Okay, the females produce milk. Whatever.
I had some questions there.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I thought I might have learned something new about myself and something new about you.
You knew what I meant. Don't lie to me. Anyway. Yeah. So within mammals, they are ungulates, meaning things with hooves. Rhinos are only sort of like they're for sure in that group, but they don't have hooves like you think of with like a cow or a horse. Um, they have much more distinct toes, for sure, than a horse does. Um, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. Within ungulates, they are perissodactyls, meaning that they are an ungulate with an odd number of toes. Uh, other examples would be horses and tapirs. Rhinos, horses, and tapirs are the only perissodactyls alive today. There's several more groups that are no longer around. Very, very diverse fossil group, but there's just not that many of them alive today, at least different species. Humans kind of mucked that up when we domesticated horses, but just as humans are wont to do. Um, and then within the perissodactyls, there's sort of two main major groups. There is the hippomorpha, which is sort of the horse side of the perissodactyls, and the tapiromorpha, the tapir rhino side of the family tree. So rhinos are on the tapir side. And then here's where things get a little weird, because for the most part, um, when you refer to a group by its colloquial name, it generally refers to the family. So, for example, things like tigers and lions and even your house cat, even scientists refer to them as cats. Maybe not formally in a paper, but they're all in the same family. They're in the family Felidae. And you just generally refer to them as cats. Same thing with dogs, whether it was a domesticated dog or a wolf or, like African painted dogs, which are not in the same genus or even all that closely related. Or even things that are no longer around, like the bone crushing dogs that I also worked with for my thesis. Those are all in the family Canidae, and they're just called dogs. So I assumed, going into this episode, that rhinos would mean the family that rhinos are in, Rhinoceratidae. That apparently is not the case, which actually made this episode more fun for me.
Big news.
This made this episode more fun for me because it apparently includes the entire super family of the Rhinoceratoidea.
Whoa. Super family?
Yeah, so there are, I want to say, like 17 named ranks. Superfamily is above family but below order. Sure. Taxonomy is weird. We've had a whole episode about it, and I could have several more episodes realistically. But yeah, Rhinoceratoidea, or rhinoceratoids, if you're referring to just a member of that group, are what most people refer to as rhinos in general. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We will for sure talk about the living members that we have today in quite a bit of detail, but we're also going to talk, of course, about their fossil relatives as well. But first, let's go over a little bit of what a rhino even is. So this is going to be mostly focused on some of the living rhinos, just because they're what most people kind of have as their frame of reference. So describe briefly to me, Mike, a rhino.
Oh, geez. So it's big, it's gray, there's a horn. I feel like they're aggressive, tail 4 feet. I feel so. Spoiler alert, in case this isn't obvious. I don't have a great grasp of what makes a rhino a rhino. It's we have talked about the Supreme Court's definition of porn a whole lot here.
Yes, we have.
I guess the best way I could phrase it is like an elephant-looking thing with horns instead of like a big long tusk.
Okay.
It's got like horns on its nose, snout, whatever you might want to call it. That's, I think, as good as I'm going to be able to do when I think of rhino. I guess when I said unicorn at the beginning, because I just pulled up a picture. I guess when I said unicorn at the beginning, that's not entirely true because it looks like they mostly have two of these horns.
That depends, and we'll get into that.
So, I guess okay. So a sort of elephant adjacent looking thing with the primary difference being horns and no tusk
Okay.
is what I'm going with, but that is a rather poor way to go about this, I think.
Not as poor as you might think. Because I want to say that I mentioned this in
Really?
our episode about elephants. Let me, because I actually have referenced this episode later in the episode. Um, da, 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 da. Episode 26, we talked about elephants and their relatives. But
Oh,
there
wow.
was a brief moment in time where instead of classifying groups of animals by their ancestry and connectedness, we did it by shared features, which you might think are the same thing, but not necessarily. So, for example, birds and mammals were grouped more closely related together because we are warm blooded. Obviously, there are many things that are more closely related to birds than they are to mammals, things like lizards, crocodiles, and such, that are quote unquote cold blooded. But under this system that was used for only a handful of years back in the relatively early 1900s, that's how things were categorized. And one group that was made under that system was a group called Pachydermata. You might have heard of a pachyderm, which is a general term for, these days I think it's mostly referring to elephants, but it means thick skin, and it was a group made up of elephants, rhinos, and hippos, because they all have generally thick, tough, grayish brown skin. So there was an
Are we ever going
official,
to have a hippo episode?
maybe the hippo fossil record's not great. I'll put it on the list, but
Really? Okay.
yeah, it might be tied into a whales episode because whales are super cool.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. All right.
but yeah, so you wouldn't be totally wrong in grouping them with elephants historically, but these days, as we classify things
Okay.
these days, yeah, that's not a great comparison. Although they are generally the second largest land animals. The African white rhino is, I believe, the largest land mammal that is, or land animal in general, that is not an elephant. So they
Mm-hmm.
do have a lot of overlap there. But I sort of generally think of rhinos as like a kid's, they're playing with action figures of like a horse, and they're like, what if I just put a bunch of armor on it and put a big spike on the front? And that's kind of a rhino. So, unlike their horse cousins, because as I said, they're in the same group, they're in the same order as horses, rhinos are mainly browsers. Horses mainly eat grass and tougher plant materials. Rhinos generally, there were lots of grazing rhinos in the past, but most of them today eat leafy material and twigs instead of grasses. They're able to eat grasses, especially the two African species, but generally they eat leaves instead. Rhino teeth are actually really interesting. They're not as derived and specialized as horse teeth. Head back to, I don't remember what episode it was about horses. I believe I reference it later in the episode, though, so stay tuned. But in our episode about horses, we talk a whole lot about horse teeth because they're incredibly specialized. Rhino teeth aren't quite as specialized as horses, and they actually, in cross section, form a similar shape to the Greek letter pi, which is interesting.
Oh,
Yeah, they're really interesting.
like
Um,
like pi 3.14, like that's what we're talking about? That
mhm,
shape?
yeah.
Okay.
So, like horses and other ungulates, they walk on the very tips of their toes, like ballerinas. But unlike horses, they have 3 toes on each foot, and they have a pad in their feet like elephants do, which is a general adaptation for things just being really large and really heavy. Um, and they also have several things that are called sesamoid bones in their feet for extra support. And lots of animals have these. I
Mm-hmm.
believe that humans have a couple in their feet as well, but these ones do some extra heavy lifting. And I was fuzzy on the meaning of what a sesamoid bone was, so I looked it up, and now I want to share it with you because it's really fascinating. So,
Okay, please do.
Sesamoid bones are bones that are embedded within a tendon or a muscle. So it's a bone like inside.
Within
Yes. So
what
you
purpose does that serve?
sometimes they form due to a sprain. If you've ever sprained your ankle, you probably notice that your ankle is more stiff than it used to be. That's because some of the tendons, it's called ossified. They became bone, or at least if they're not fully bone, they have bone in them now and are stiffer and less flexible than they used to be. They can be used to heal things like that. However, they do sort of just kind of form in order to act like a pulley and provide better leverage. Sometimes also just for a smooth surface for tendons to slide over. Um, for example, your kneecap is a sesamoid bone. It's the largest sesamoid bone in most animals' bodies. But you'll notice, your kneecap's not like actually attached to your leg. It is entirely within like the tendon that goes from, your thigh to your calf.
Uh, I mean, yeah, but it's not inside the tent. Like the tendons, attached to it in like pulling it, but like the bone itself is not inside the tendon, right?
To my knowledge, it is. I
Wait,
have
what? Really?
I've never dissected
Really?
a human leg, but to my knowledge, yeah.
So when I'm like just like tapping on my kneecap, like I don't know if the listeners can hear that, but I'm tapping my kneecap right now. I'm like actually hitting the tendon before I'm hitting the bone.
So in humans, I don't know. I'm not a human anatomist. In
Okay.
in several animals, yeah. So again,
That's
take
wild.
that with a
That's
grain of salt.
wild.
I don't know human anatomy all that well. Um,
Okay, so but assuming that we're talking about animals, there are bones that are literally inside of tendons and ligaments,
for sure, and even
not
if
just that are
mhm.
wow.
Even if the patella is a bad example, like if your kneecap's a bad example, you have several in your foot. Um, a way that you can tell if say you find like a human skeleton or just the general skeleton of a mammal. If you look at the sesamoid bones I believe in humans, it's actually called like the sesamoid bone. It's on your thumb, and if it's ossified, that generally means that individual has hit puberty. If it's not ossified, that means the individual is not. So you can generally get a rough age estimate based on that.
Huh. I I never knew this was possible. This like I don't even know what to say other than you've already blown my mind,
Yeah. Well, thank you.
less than halfway through this episode.
That's what I go for. So we're going to get into the modern diversity quite a bit here. So this is kind of the easiest way that I kind of found to define a rhino, because I looked up for like an actual taxonomic definition because every group has one, and it was not readily available to me. And because of my work schedule, I was unable to search super high and low for it. There obviously is one. I was not able to find a great like this is what separates rhinos for sure from their close relatives that are not rhinos. So there is a definition for it. Just due to my life
Okay.
circumstances, I was not able to find it. So modern diversity. So there are 5 living species of rhinos in 4 genera, the plural of genus. So we're going to start off with the Indian rhino, which is in the genus Rhinoceros, funnily enough. But the species is Rhinoceros unicornis because it only has 1 horn.
Huh, you're kidding. You're kidding.
So this is not the one that I said we were going to be circling back to. There's another one that I
Jeez.
think you'll get a kick of at the very end. And so something that you probably know about rhinos, if you've heard anything about them, is that they're not doing that well right now. So for each of the
Oh,
5,
really?
yeah, rhinos in general are doing really poorly because of many cultural reasons. Mostly it's that many cultures use their horns in their traditional medicines. And rhinos are pretty dangerous animals, so the best way
Really?
to get their horn is to kill it and take it off.
When you say use their horns in medicines, like, is this proven science that is being done,
Absolutely not.
or is this pseudoscience?
It's absolutely pseudoscience because so a rhino's horn
Okay.
is made up of keratin. I think there might be a couple other components. Some things that I read suggested that the center of it might have some calcium in it, might have a couple other different kinds of, um, things or like a melanin things to make it harder. But in general, it's just keratin, which is the same stuff that your hair and your fingernails are made out of. So a lot of
Okay.
cultures would sometimes grind them up and into like a powder and make various things to treat different ailments for it. In a lot of cultures, it's powdered rhino horn is seen as an aphrodisiac. So
Uh-huh.
there's literally no evidence for that at all. You would get the same effect if you cut off a bunch of your hair, like your own hair, and ground that up and ate it / drank it. You can buy there for sure are keratin supplements you can buy at
Jeez.
like a drugstore.
Now that's in my head.
Yeah. There are for sure like keratin supplements at drugstores and things. But those help you grow hair or have healthier hair or skin because there's some keratin in your skin as well. But that's pretty much it. So there's no science at all to rhino horns being any kind of medicinal use. So, which makes it all the more tragic. Not that it would be like untragic if we were killing all these really cool animals for their horns, even if it did have some kind of medical effect, but the fact that it doesn't is just very sad and very stupid. Uh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah.
so with each of these rhino species, I'm going to list also how they are doing in the wild, how many individuals there are, and sort of how well they're doing in captivity as well. So, that little rant aside, going back to the Indian rhinoceros, which is Rhinoceros unicornis, it is listed as vulnerable in the terms of like endangered. It basically goes
Isn't that a
endangered.
step above endangered?
Yes, it is. It goes basically
Okay.
extinct is the worst, obviously. Critically endangered, vulnerable, and not registered because it's doing okay. So they are vulnerable.
Okay.
There are about 3,600 individuals in the wild, which might not sound like a lot, but they're all pretty well protected mostly in a single really, really big national park in India.
Really, in one place.
I mean, you can find them other places as well. I think you can find them in Nepal as well, but mostly in India. Yeah, which
Okay.
again, it's. I remember looking at their like native range, and it wasn't like massive to begin with, to my knowledge, at least for the Indian rhinoceros.
Huh.
So,
Okay.
but they're also doing really well in captive breeding programs, which is encouraging. So,
Yeah. Good
next,
news.
in the same genus, we have the Javan rhino from the island of Java, which is in like Southeast Asia in the Pacific, which is Rhinoceros sundaicus. And this one, sadly, is critically endangered. There are less than 70 individuals in the wild and none in captivity. So,
Jeez.
they are obviously really highly protected, but obviously, poachers gonna poach. So they are.
I mean, this seems like a really, even if they're really well protected, that's such a small number. It seems like to be kind of relying, like it's almost like a single point of failure. It seems like okay, we got these ones in one protected area, and we're gonna do a good job.
That for sure is a
Like single
problem.
points of failure always kind of scare me.
Yeah, that definitely is a problem. Other rhino species that we're going to talk about have come back from fewer than that to be doing relatively well today. So it is
Okay.
possible, albeit pretty unlikely, because, like I said, there are none in captivity, and we never really figured out how to make them happy and breed in captivity. In fact, they kept dying relatively young. So
Hmm.
I
Okay.
don't believe there have been any in captivity for at least 50, if not closer to 100 years. So, like, it might be easier to try it now, but there are so few of them, I feel like people are kind of scared to try.
So someone should give it a shot.
So, next, we have the Sumatran rhino, also from Southeast Asia, which is a separate genus. We're no longer in the genus Rhinoceros, but this is Dicerorhinus sumatrensis, is the species of this one, which is also sadly critically endangered. Depending on whose estimate you're going off of, there are anywhere from 30 to 80 individuals. There was some captive success, at like breeding them in zoos. Those programs are now all located in Indonesia because there are so few of them that they want them all sort of centrally located, so they can like better keep track of their progress. And that there's a whole bunch
Okay.
of controversy around that one as well that we're not going to go into because we don't have time. But it's a really interesting read, actually. So then we have the by far the most populous, the one that's doing the best, rhino, which is the African white rhino, which is Ceratotherium sinum, which is classified as near threatened. Uh, so that's sort of a step above
We're on the
vulnerable.
lookout.
Right. It's something that they're watching, but they're doing roughly okay now. There are roughly 20,000 of them total. Um, I think that actually might just be the wild number. They're actually doing pretty well in captivity. If you've ever seen a rhino in a zoo, I can pretty much guarantee it was one of these. Um,
Okay.
so I will say there is two subspecies of this. The southern white rhino is the one that's doing really well. The northern white rhino subspecies, there are two individuals left, and they're both female. So that one's sadly going extinct.
That makes me sad.
Yeah. And lastly, for the living species, there's the African black rhino, which is Diceras bicornis instead of unicornis, because this one has two horns, which is also sadly critically endangered. There are around 5,500 individuals in the wild, and I was not able to find a number for if there are any in captivity, so I'm inclined to say that there's not. I don't know that for a fact, but I didn't find any good numbers for if there even were any to begin with. Um, and so, with that, that's our 5 species that we have around today. And uh, a little quick misnomer about the white and black rhino.
Oh boy.
They're neither white nor black. um,
Oh, okay.
yeah, so they both can range from like a really light tan or gray to being sort of darker, not really quite black, but also definitely not white. So the white rhino, we're not sure of like the etymology why it's called the white rhino. Some things that I read said that it might have been from a native word from one of the local tribes, or potentially a mispronunciation of a word from Dutch from when they were colonizing the area. Either way, that one's called the white rhino for weird reasons, but the black rhino is called the black rhino so that you could differentiate it from the white rhino and you could know which one you're talking about, not because it's actually black. So, yeah. Uh, and then last thing for these living species. So they have a weird phylogeny, which is sort of their tree of life between the 5 of them. Everyone's pretty sure. Everyone pretty much agrees that obviously the 2 species in the genus Rhinoceros are closely related, close enough to be in the same genus, and that the 2 African species are closely related to each other. But the Sumatran rhino is the one that kind of screws some things up. Sometimes it's grouped with the species in the genus Rhinoceros, so that'd be the Indian and Javan rhino. Sometimes it's sort of outside of the other 4. Most things that I saw grouped it with the Indian and Javan rhinos, like including the Wikipedia. Um, which also
Oh,
conflicted
really?
itself. Well, it conflicted itself because the Wikipedia article kept mentioning that it was the most ancient living species based on its DNA. So I'm assuming that they meant that it was the most basal, like the outgroup. But the only cladogram, like actual like tree of life diagram that they had on the Wikipedia page, had it in the middle instead of on the
Hmm.
outside. So,
Oh,
um,
okay.
yeah, I read it. I even like read a couple papers because I was really interested, and I did not find a definitive result. So, yeah, take that with a grain of salt.
Open question, I guess.
Yeah. So those were our rhinos we have today. But how did they get to be that way? So, rhinos and tapirs make up a group of perissodactyls called the ceratomorpha, which means horn shape, I believe is what that means. But I believe that just the cerato is in reference to rhinos because the vast majority of ceratomorphs don't actually have horns. To my knowledge, there are no horned tapirs, and I would say even the vast majority of rhinos aren't even horned, which is weird because you think of rhinos and you think of the horn, but the majority of them were not horned.
Yeah. What?
Yeah, and so
That can't be correct.
it definitely is. So
Oh, wow.
extremely diverse ceratomorphs have a very, very diverse fossil record, despite there only being 4 genera of rhinos and 1 genus of tapir today. So the living diversity is not like a good representation of their historical diversity. The first ceratomorphs show up in sort of the Middle Eocene epoch, around 45 million years ago. And during this time, the world was like really, really wet and really warm and very forested. You would not find places like the Great Plains anywhere on the planet at all. Um, it was all very, very foresty. And it was around this time where the ceratomorphs split into the Tapiroidea, the tapir side of it, and the Rhinoceratoidea, the ones that we're talking about today, the rhinoceroses. And the rhinoceroses can be split
Quick
up.
pause. I
Yeah.
got a quick question for you. So, when it comes to the plural of rhinoceros, is it rhinoceroses or rhinoceri?
I would say rhinoceri. I did not see that anywhere. I saw, you could say rhinoceros
Okay,
as the
so
plural or rhinoceroses.
good
Also,
to know. All right,
I,
that was just sometimes things just come to my
mhm.
head.
No, for sure. And also, I should have mentioned this at the beginning. The word rhinoceros means horn nose, which I think is
Oh, does it
funny.
really?
It
Okay.
does, which I think is funny given that, like I said, the majority of them may, depending on, if I would say the majority of groups were not horned, depending on how you count it, the majority of species may or may not have, but we'll get into that.
I mean, look at that's still. I'm gonna pretend like I didn't hear that part of the fact, and I just heard that rhinoceros means horn nose,
Yeah.
and I'm just gonna love every minute. Also, just side note, as we're half-ish way through this episode, for me, you're coming in and out like robot voice. I'm not sure what the listeners are hearing, but if you kind of
Oh
pause for
no.
a second, I don't say anything, it's because I have no idea what was going on. So this has happened before, and it's turned out fine. But just throwing that out there.
Okay. Well, we're gonna truck on and see what happens.
We're having fun regardless. Absolutely, that's the goal.
So, the rhinoceratoids are generally made up of 3 families. 4, depending on who you ask. We'll talk about that. So, the first one is the Amenodontidae, generally from around the late Eocene, so around 38 million years ago, to the late Oligocene or early Miocene, around 25 million years ago. Mostly found in Asia and North America, and generally depicted as semi-aquatic and like almost hippo-like, to the point where some of them were referred to as swamp rhinos, which I think is funny. Um,
Yeah.
and so some of them, like that's true for some of them. Some of them did have that general shape. For example, one of the most common group members of this group that I saw talked about was called Metamynodon, which had generally like hippo proportions, a big barrel-shaped body, really short legs, um, and really big, almost tusk-like canine teeth, which most rhinos today lack. They don't even have canines. So really interesting that they had tusks similar to hippos almost. But sadly, they went extinct. Generally, not that they weren't around for super long. Like I said, they made it until around 25 million years ago, so they were around for less than 20 million years. Still a good run, but not around for super long. Plus, it's generally the least studied of all of these groups that we're talking about, so there's just not a ton of information about them in general.
Why is that? Why are they the least studied?
I don't know if they just weren't as prolific. There weren't as many of them. Some of the areas that I think they're found in might not be the most sampled, particularly in Asia. Because I know Eocene and Oligocene stuff in North America is pretty well studied. So I think that they just weren't. Probably the fossils that we have of them probably aren't great as well. So it could be a variety of
Okay.
reasons. I didn't really find anything specific other than they're not that well studied.
Homework for the listener, I guess.
Yeah. So the next group, which is one that I really enjoy, is the family Hyracodontid, which are generally referred to as the running rhinos. I guess
Okay.
I
The
guess
running
other
rhinos.
rhinos can't run. Uh, um,
Is that true, or is that just, are we going based on names?
oh no, rhinos can definitely run. Rhinos can run quite fast. Uh,
Okay. So this is like a, it either misnamed, or it's, it
so
implies other rhinos can't run, which is not correct, right?
well, these are just especially adapted for running. So from
Okay.
this group goes from the early Eocene, so around 48 million years ago, to the early Miocene, also around 25 million years ago. So they go extinct around the same time that the previous group did. But these are found in Asia and North America, as well as Europe, which I don't believe the Aminodonts were not found in Europe at all, to my knowledge. Um, and the key
Hmm.
feature of this group is that they have really long legs that are adapted for a more running lifestyle, which is interesting because when they first show up in the early Eocene, uh, that was not the most preferential lifestyle, just because if you're really good at running, um, that might not be the best adaptation for a forest, because you'd have to weave in and out of trees a lot, and being well adapted for running generally limits your flexibility. We talked about this in the horses episode
Does it
because
really?
yeah, because
Okay.
horses, at least the modern horses we have today, are really good at running really fast in a single direction for a long time. They're not very good at changing directions on a dime because those are just different anatomical adaptations. Being able to turn on a dime like that is really good in a forest where there's lots of trees around and you have to turn a lot. But if you're out on the plains, where there's not a lot that you're gonna have to turn really suddenly for, uh, you don't need it. So you can just run as fast as you can in a single direction, and that if you're trying to outrun a predator, that might be good enough.
All right.
So
I mean, that, if that's all it takes.
yeah, uh, and to my knowledge, oh, I forgot to mention this for the previous group. No members of the Aminodontids had horns, and also to my knowledge, no Hyracodonts had horns either. So we're in
Okay.
we're two of the three families traditionally in. They're considered rhinos. They are all called rhinoceroses, but they don't have horns. One of the defining characteristics that most people think of when they think about rhinos.
This might be the most depressing thing I've gotten from this episode. Is just, not all rhinos have horns, and what are we doing if that's the case?
But that doesn't make them less cool, as we will talk about.
Okay, well then let's get there.
So, the Hyracodontid started out relatively small, probably around the size of like a medium to large dog. Um, and with the Hyracoodonts, and honestly, like in a lot of other bits of taxonomy, there's a bit of controversy with them. Uh, there's a couple of subfamilies that some people have argued should be their own families outright. And with one especially, I would probably agree, given that I don't study rhinos. My opinion doesn't really matter, but uh, we'll talk about those weirdos in just a second because they're real cool. But generally, Hyracoodonts look a lot like early horses that we talked about in episode 17. There it is. Episode 17 was about horses. Uh, and they're, like I said, relatively small. Although these Hyracoodonts were generally bigger than the early horses that we talked about then. Had longer legs, as you would expect for things that are good at running. Had multiple toes, unlike horses. Generally slender bodies, longer necks. You would have a really hard time telling the difference between these and early horses.
Okay. Huh.
So the main genus that is talked about a lot with Hyracoodonts is the genus Hyracoodon. And this was the most prominent genus within this group, and it went from the Middle Eocene to the late Oligocene, so like 45 to 25 million years, was around for a really good stretch. There were 11 species in this genus, all with roughly the same build, different anatomical features, obviously, enough to differentiate it and call them different species, but all were generally about 5 feet long, maybe around 3 feet tall. And the earlier species ate mostly leaves, but the later species ate more grass as the climate cooled and grass became more widespread. Again, as we talked about in the horse episode. So now for the weirdos that I was just talking about.
All right. I'm into
So
weird. Weirdos is kind of my brand, so let's do it.
So this is a group that is generally classified as a subfamily of Hyracoodontidae. The subfamily is called Indricotheriinae. Sometimes you'll hear it called Paraceratheridae, or some people think that this should be its own family, which would be called Paraceratheriidae. If it ends in a day, that means a family. If it ends in a nay, that usually means a subfamily. So,
Oh, good to know. Noted for the future.
yeah. So, and the reason why there's multiple different names for this is because the first one of these found was mistakenly identified as something. And so it was initially called, or something else. Yeah, the first one was initially called Paraceratherium, which means near hornless beast. And so that was mistakenly thought to be just a regular rhino, not a member of this group. And then they sort of realized the mistake. And so there's just some general confusion about this name in general. And it's because it became very popular because it is real big. Back in episode 26 about the elephants, I mentioned that certain elephants and elephant relatives are contenders for the largest land mammals ever. These are the other contender for largest land mammals ever. And
Okay.
there
When
really
we say
are no
contenders,
other
what do you mean?
contenders. There's really no other contenders. It's basically just elephants and these guys.
Oh, okay. But we're talking about like by weight, by height, by like.
We'll get there. So,
Okay.
as with most groups that are really like physically large, they started off generally pretty small, with genera like Forster Couperia, which I think is just a fun name for a genus, and Papaceras, also a fun name, which were still similar to Hyracoodon, about the size of like a big dog, maybe like somewhere between Greyhound and Great Dane sort of size. And also similar body proportions, really long legs, long neck, skinny, long head. But then they got real big. And the main genus that you'll see talked a lot about is Paraceratherium, which, depending on how you...
Which is a great name. It just sounds wonderful.
It is. I really like this name. And it was actually... So there is another... I believe that this other one is like an actual rhino in the rhino family. which I believe is called Acertherium, which means hornless beast. And they thought that this was closely related, so they called it Paraceratherium, which means like near hornless beast, because people like to name stuff weird. And it turned out it wasn't even that closely related, so joke's on them. Uh, but Paraceratherium is, depending on how you classify largest, the largest land mammal ever. So, unfortunately, there is no complete skeleton of these guys. So, from what we can tell, so you have to take this with a grain of salt because having a whole skeleton would be really helpful. But we also don't have a whole skeleton of a lot of like the elephants that we were talking about in this size range. So, but from what we can tell for these guys, it was about 16 to 17 feet tall at the shoulder. Real big.
At the shoulder. Wow.
At the shoulder. And had a neck anywhere from 6 to 8 feet long. So like giraffe length neck, starting at a height of 16 to 17 feet off the ground. And a skull.
That's excessive.
Yeah, a skull also over 4 feet long. So by far the physically
I have no words for
tallest.
that. I mean,
yeah, by far like the physically tallest land mammal ever, like by a substantial margin. And by weight, probably about the same, if possibly a little bit less than some of the largest elephant cousins. Most estimates that I've seen put it somewhere around 15 to 20 tons, although I did see some more conservative estimates that put it close to 11 tons.
I mean, still.
So 10 tons is like a big male African elephant. So 11 tons, these are generally built quite a bit more slender than like an elephant body plan, but still, to be this big, you have to have many, many special adaptations for being that large, which I fully plan on doing an entire episode about gigantism, because that's a topic that I just really, really enjoy. Just like how things can physically
I've
be
heard
this
of that, yeah.
large.
That'd be a cool one.
Yeah, how things can physically be this large and still function. So more details on that eventually. So really, really cool. This is an animal that Mike or I could stand underneath, and our heads would not even like scrape its belly.
And to be clear, neither of us are small men.
No, we're both roughly 6 foot tall or a little taller. So, yeah, most
Correct.
people could comfortably stand under this thing and not touch its belly at all. Massive, massive, massive animals. So, moving on from there, we have the final family in this group, which is the Rhinoceratidae, or you might see it called the true rhinos, mostly because the rhinos that we have today are in this group. So, like the other groups, they first appear in the Eocene, the late Eocene, in Eurasia. And they're pretty diverse around this time, but they're pretty small in general, like a lot of their relatives at this time. But some did get quite a bit bigger relatively early on, such as Subhyrachodon, which is a genus of hornless species. So even though we're in the actual rhino family now, we still have hornless members. But yeah, Subhyrachodon was slightly bigger, probably like big dog sized, maybe body proportions more similar to maybe like a relatively slender Great Bernard or Saint Bernard. So really stocky, maybe a little more slender than a Saint Bernard would be, but about that size. Then in the middle Oligocene, there was kind of an extinction for most of these guys that mostly killed off a lot of the small ones. Pretty much only the larger size ones were still around. That could have been anything from just changing environments to increased competition to a variety of things. But the big ones were pretty much the only ones left after around this time. And so from around the middle Oligocene into the early Miocene, which was around 25 to 20 or so million years ago, that's when we start to get horns on a lot of these guys. So even though
Yes,
the group of
horns.
rhinos, the group of rhinos in general has been around for close to 50 million years, we only get horns, maybe only like 20 million years ago. So for the majority of the time this group's been around, there were not horns on these animals. So,
Jeez,
one of the
that's
first.
sad.
Why?
It's one of those things where, as a little kid, like, what makes a rhino different than anything else? Well, it's big and it has a horn, and it's one of those things. It's like learning that the Scooby Gang were probably potheads,
Oh my
or that Columbus didn't
god.
discover America. Like, it's something that I needed to hear because it's the truth, but it strips a little bit of, like, oh, okay, I really am not a kid anymore. Like, life comes at you fast. That's what makes it sad.
We do not endorse Columbus on this podcast. Columbus is in the bad place. Uh, if you
No,
ever,
I get to talk about Columbus is going to be my next seventh grade lesson. When I go to Thursday, we're doing the Christopher Columbus lesson, and I don't scream as loud on any other lesson as I do with Columbus. Like, people in other floors can hear me, and it's glorious. I love doing that lesson because I
like
hate Columbus.
he wasn't even the first European person to make it to North America. Get on Leif Erikson's level.
Yeah, right. There is so much to unpack that we can do it at another time, but
Yeah, for sure.
another time
Anywho,
it is.
so the first horned rhino that I was able to find, there might have been some earlier than this, but this was the first one that I was able to find. Is called Minoceras, or Minoceras is probably how you actually pronounce that. But this was about pig-sized, and this one had two horns, but instead of the rhinos we have today, they have two horns where there's one in front and then one behind it. This was two horns side by side at the end of the nose, which is real weird.
Side by side at the end of the nose.
Yes.
Okay.
I can't think of
Huh.
any animal that has horns like that today. In fact, actually, no other animals have horns like on their face today, which
Yeah,
is, kind of why rhinos have the name horn nose.
that's a weird one.
Um, so yeah, that was the first one that I was able to find, which was, like I said, from around this time, around 20, 25 million years ago or so. Teleoceras is another species from a separate lineage than our living rhinos today. But this was a lineage that for a long time people thought also evolved convergently with hippos, like those swamp rhinos from before, because they have a lot of those weird semi-aquatic looking adaptations. Short, stocky legs, big barrel-shaped bodies, but based on some chemical, like isotope evidence from their bones and teeth, that's not really supported anymore. Just because you get different isotopes from eating like aquatic plants or even just spending a lot of time in the water, your teeth and bones will take in isotopes from the water that will make your bones give off a different signature than they would if you hadn't done that. So, based on that evidence, it seems like they weren't that weird semi-aquatic thing, but they were just kind of doing something. They were kind of doing their own thing. They didn't really need long legs for stuff, so they didn't have them.
Okay.
So Teleoceras is the genus of rhino that I had at my site for my master's thesis. So this is one of my personal favorites. And even though they weren't doing the hippo thing, them and some other somewhat closely related rhinos, such as Aphalops, which is also just a fun name, had tusks as well as small horns, which is neat. Rhinos today
What's
are.
the difference?
So the horn is made out of keratin. There's no bone in it. There's no teeth in it. It's
Right.
literally just keratin, which isn't even attached to their skull properly. It sits on there, and like their blood vessels leave patterns on their skull, so you can tell that like there was a horn there, but it's not made out of bone. Tusks are teeth, and
Oh, okay.
so
Gotcha.
you
The
could
teeth is bone.
Yeah, well, partially. You could argue that rhino tusks aren't like actually tusks because I think to technically be a tusk, it has to be ever growing, like an elephant's tusk is. Where it's like if an elephant breaks its tusk, it will, you know, grow back eventually. I don't believe these were like that. They grew over time and pretty consistently for quite a few years, but they were not ever growing. So they did stop eventually. So it's like technically,
Okay.
depending on what definition you're using, may or may not be a tusk. But the way that they had them was really neat because, like those swamp rhinos from before, or unlike the swamp rhinos who use their canine teeth as tusks, these ones use their lower incisors. So they each only have one incisor on each side of their lower jaw, and it's pretty much like really long and conical and pointed. And the upper incisors were flat and really hard and were used to sharpen the lower incisors when they chewed. So the top teeth would grind the lower teeth into a point as they just ate food.
Wow. What,
Super
like as they
cool.
got older, I assume. That's one
Yeah,
hell of an adaptation.
yeah. So they would the teeth really started growing in like that once they started to hit puberty. And there's a big amount of sexual dimorphism in these teeth. So, for example, I had a male and a female rhino in my collection that I worked on for my master's thesis, and you could tell that because the one male, obviously, the jaw was a bit bigger, but like the incisors were massive, um, like 6 inches, 7 inches long, and you could easily fit a quarter inside of it, like diameter wise. It was really big. And then the jaw that was clearly a female, the tooth was only about like pencil size in width. So like the males had much bigger
Oh,
tusks than the females did.
wow.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, good stuff.
And so Teleoceras was the last rhino to live in North America and ended up going extinct around the late Miocene, early Pliocene, which was around 5 million years ago. And you probably have noticed, if you happen to live in North America, that there are no rhinos living here that were not brought here by people. And so all of the rhinos that we have today, like I talked about earlier, are either living in Africa or like Southeast Asia. So the 5 living rhinos that we have today are all in the subfamily Rhinoceratinae, which evolved in the Middle Oligocene. And all but the Sumatran rhino are in the tribe Rhinoceratini. Rhinoceratini. So if it ends in ini, ini, that usually means a tribe. And most of that was relatively recently. Each of these species evolved sometime during the late Pleistocene or middle Pleistocene in some cases. So give or take 1 to 2 million years ago. And I want to end with a couple of my favorite rhinos that are actually in the rhino family proper, because one of them is a relatively close relative to the modern rhinos, which is Coelodonta, which is the
And are these all
genus.
extinct?
Yes, these ones are extinct.
Okay.
So Coelodonta is the genus for the woolly rhino, which was a close relative to, I believe, the Sumatran rhino, the one that's a weirdo that we can't really figure out where it fits. It was closely
Whoa.
related to this guy.
Woolly rhino.
Yeah.
A woolly rhino.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yes. Sign me up. Sign me up for some movies where we bring back the woolly rhino. We've had enough of the dinosaur Jurassic Park stuff. I want woolly rhinos.
Yeah, so I mean, like with the woolly mammoth, it's just sort of an adaptation for, uh, you know, being in a cold climate. And so these were native to Eurasia in the Pleistocene and went extinct around 10,000 years ago or so, around the same time that mammoths did, probably for similar reasons. And more or less, it was around the same size as the white rhino is today. So the white rhino is the largest rhino species that we have around today. So it was roughly the same size, maybe a bit heavier, just because it's kind of bulky for living in a cold climate. And the last one that I want to talk about is my favorite.
Oh boy.
I lied. It's not my favorite. Paraceratherium, the giant one, is my favorite.
Okay.
But one of my
Number 2,
favorites, and we're going full circle again here. So this is a genus called Elasmotherium, which is the largest member of the rhino family proper, so the Rhinoceratidae, that I was able to find. There might be a bigger one,
Okay.
but it's the biggest one that I could find. So this one weighed anywhere from 4 to 4.5 tons. So a big animal. That's probably on like the absolute upper limit of like white rhino size. And around 6 to 7 feet tall at the shoulder. So a really big animal. And its horn could have been up to like about 6 feet long, potentially.
Okay.
But instead of being on its nose, it was on its forehead.
Is this the unicorn?
This is the unicorn.
Yeah. Ah. Yes.
So sometimes I've heard to this referred to as, because there's one species that I believe is Elasmotherium sibericus. So I've heard of it called the Siberian rhino or Siberian unicorn.
Siberian. Ooh, I like that name.
Because it's just got this big old horn, which like at the base of it could have been 3 feet around, not in diameter, but in like circumference, at the base of its head. So like very, very large horn, just smack dab in the middle of its face.
I mean, it's a shame they're not around anymore, is all I have to say, because there's a lot of like 8-year-olds that would have parents pay a lot of money to have one of those get painted and show up at a birthday party.
Yeah, these guys actually went extinct longer ago than the woolly rhino did. I think these ones went extinct closer to 40,000 years ago. But they were also native to like Eurasia mostly as well. I don't believe they ever made it down to Africa, and definitely were not in North America. But yeah, so that is.
Hey, they walked the earth, and that's good enough for me.
Yeah, so this is our overview of rhinoceroses or rhinoceri, or all of the cool horned, maybe not horned, groups that that I know and love.
All things rhino, and it was certainly a journey for me to take, and I hope you, the listeners, enjoyed it. This has been episode 46 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Mike, and that is Gavin, and we'll be back again next week with something new from the science world. Take care, everybody.